Exiled into the dark, howling timber by the pious residents of Spearfish Canyon, Cora Whitaker was essentially handed a death sentence. The cold that winter was severe enough to shatter bone, and her community fully expected the elements to finish her off. Instead, the unforgiving Black Hills revealed their ancient secrets to her, sparking a fierce, unyielding resolve. Cora was done dying. The gavel didn't fall. Rowan Abernathy's heavy fist did, slamming against the scarred oak of the town hall podium. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the freezing, damp air of the room. Cora Whitaker stood in the center of the floor, her wrists raw where the coarse hemp rope bound them, her breath pluming in the drafty hall. It was mid-October in the Dakota Territory, but the frost was already thick enough to snap underfoot. The settlement of Oak Haven was a harsh place, carved out of the pine and limestone by desperate men and governed by men even more desperate to keep what they had taken. Rowan Abernathy was a chief among them, acting as mayor, magistrate, and, when it suited him, executioner. "The council has heard the testimonies," Rowan bellowed, his voice thick with false solemnity. He didn't look at Cora. He looked at the deed sitting on the table in front of him, the deed to the 300 acres of prime river-bottom timberland that had belonged to Cora's late husband, William. William had died of consumption 3 weeks prior. Before the soil on his grave had even settled, the accusations began. Reverend Thomas Gable stepped forward, his face a mask of pious grief. "It is a heavy thing, brethren, but the blight on the crops, the sickness in the Abernathy cattle, and the strange poultices found in the widow's cabin. Witchcraft is a word we do not use lightly, but malice is clear." Cora stared at them, her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. It wasn't witchcraft. It was a willow bark and yarrow compress she had used to try and soothe her dying husband's fever. But the truth had no currency in Oak Haven. Not when Rowan Abernathy wanted her timber, and not when her own sister, Martha, now Rowan's wife, sat in the front row, refusing to meet Cora's eye. Martha had traded her sister's life for a guarantee of comfort in Rowan's sprawling estate. "I'm no witch, Rowan, and you know it." Cora's voice was a low rasp, dry and cracked. "You want the land, you want the timber to sell to the railroad. Still very much grieving the loss, and set herself to task of finding a dry place to stand." A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Rowan's face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. "Silence!" Rowan roared. "For the crimes of malice, for the unnatural arts practiced within our borders, this council strips Cora Whitaker of all property and protections. You are cast out. You will be escorted to the boundary of the Black Timber. If you are found within 10 miles of Oak Haven after sundown, you will be shot on sight." They didn't give her a horse. They didn't give her a rifle. Deputy Cole Higgins, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19, was tasked with the escort. He looked terrified of her, or perhaps terrified of what he was being asked to do. He marched her 2 miles up the steep, jagged incline of the canyon trail, the wind biting through Cora's wool shawl. When they reached the boundary line, a withered, lightning-struck ponderosa pine cole stalked. He wouldn't look at her. He unclasped the ropes binding her wrists. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker," he mumbled, his breath catching in the freezing wind. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy canvas sack, dropping it in the dirt at her feet. "It ain't much, but it's all I could sneak past Mr. Prof. Abernathy." Cora rubbed her bleeding wrists and looked down. Inside the sack was a rusted, broad-headed hatchet, a flint and steel, a tin cup, a skin of water, and a single, heavy woolen blanket. No food, no gun. "You're leaving me to freeze, Cole," Cora said, her voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. The Dakota winters were legendary for their brutality. The sky to the north was already turning the color of bruised iron, heavy with the promise of snow. "Keep walking south," Cole urged. swinging up onto his horse. Maybe you'll hit the mining camps near Deadwood before the snow breaks. God have mercy on you, Cora. He spurred his horse and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the gray afternoon. Cora stood alone on the ridge. The silence of the black timber was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight. She looked south toward Deadwood. It was a 50-mile trek through rugged vertical terrain, crawling with wolves, mountain lions, and treacherous ravines. In this temperature, without food, she would be dead in 3 days. She turned and looked north, deeper into the unsettled, jagged limestone canyons of the high ridge. It was suicide to go north, but Cora Whitaker was a pragmatic woman. She knew the southern trails would be washed out by the freezing rains, and she knew the mining camps were shut down for the season. "I am not dying in the snow for Rowan Abernathy," she whispered to the wind. She picked up the canvas sack, gripped the handle of the rusted hatchet, and turned her back on civilization. She walked north into the teeth of the coming storm. The first 3 nights were a lesson in agony. Cora survived only by sheer, stubborn refusal to close her eyes. She huddled beneath the exposed roots of giant pines, wrapping herself in the single woolen blanket, building pitiful, smokeless fires using dry lichen and dead fall branches. The cold was a living, breathing entity that gnawed at her extremities. Her fingers grew numb, her lips cracked and bled, and the hunger became a hollow, sharp pain beneath her ribs. On the morning of the 4th day, the sky fell. It started as a fine, hard sleet that stung her face like buckshot, quickly shifting into thick, blinding snow. Cora was stumbling along the base of a towering limestone cliff, desperately seeking any overhang. Her boots were soaked through, her movements sluggish. Hypothermia was setting in. She found herself wanting to just sit down in the snow, a dangerous, warm lethargy creeping into her blood. Then she saw it. About 30 feet up the slope, partially obscured by a thicket of scrub oak, was a deep fissure in the cliff face. It wasn't a cave, but a deep, V-shaped recess in the rock, sheltered by an overhang of solid limestone. Cora scrambled up the scree slope, her hands tearing on the sharp rocks. She collapsed into the recess. It was dry. The rock above shielded it from the falling snow, and the sheer walls blocked the biting north wind. It was roughly 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide. She sat against the back wall, panting, watching the white wall of the blizzard obscure the world outside. It was a shelter, but without a wall to enclose it, the dropping temperatures would still kill her. She needed a front wall. She needed a hearth. William had been a mason back in Pennsylvania before the Western fever took him. Cora had spent years watching him work, mixing mortar, selecting stones, and cursing the damp. She remembered his hands, dusted white, working with lime and ash. Limestone. Cora looked at the walls of her recess. They were solid limestone, and scattered all around the forest floor beneath the snow were the remnants of countless ancient forest fires. Deep, thick deposits of whitewood ash settled into the clay-like soil of the ridge. An idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her freezing mind. She crawled out into the storm, using the rusted hatchet to hack at the dead, dry scrub oak. She dragged armfuls of it back into the recess. She sparked her flint, her numb fingers fumbling until a spark caught the dry tinder. Soon, she had a roaring fire banked against the side wall of the recess. Then the real work began. Cora began gathering loose chunks of limestone from the scree slope outside. She dragged them into the fire. She built the fire higher, hotter, feeding it constantly. She needed to bake the limestone. William had told her once, if you bake limestone hot enough and long enough, it drives out the carbon dioxide. It leaves behind quicklime. For 2 days and 2 nights, as the blizzard raged outside, Cora didn't sleep. She tended the fiery kiln. She drank melted snow from her tin cup. She chewed on the inner bark of pine trees to stave off the hunger cramps. When the fire finally burned down to a mountain of glowing red coals and white ash, she used thick branches to roll the baked stones out. They had changed. They were brittle, chalky white. Carefully protecting her face with her shawl, she poured snow over the hot, baked stones. The reaction was violent. The stones hissed, cracked, and popped, releasing plumes of searing steam. They disintegrated, slaking into a fine, white, caustic paste. It was primitive lime putty. Now she needed an aggregate. She took the rusted hatchet and dug into the sheltered dry earth at the back of the recess, unearthing thick gray clay and heavy deposits of wood ash from the centuries of wildfires that had swept the canyon. She mixed the lime paste, the thick clay, and the wood ash together, using her bare hands and a flat piece of wood. The mixture was harsh. The lime burned her already raw skin, but she couldn't stop. She began dragging heavy, unbaked boulders from outside, rolling them to the mouth of the recess. She began to build a wall. Stone by stone, she closed off the opening of the V-shaped alcove. Between every heavy rock, she packed the thick, gray ashen lime mortar. She left a small opening at the bottom for a draft and a gap at the very top for a chimney smoke hole, angling it so the overhang would catch the snow but let the smoke escape. The work was grueling. Her hands bled into the gray mud. Her muscles screamed in protest, fueled by nothing but pine bark and melted snow. But as the wall grew higher, enclosing her in the small space, something miraculous happened. The mortar, rich in ash and clay, began to cure. It didn't just dry. It hardened like iron in the freezing air, creating a solid, wind-proof seal. More importantly, it acted as a thermal mass. On the fifth night, as the outside temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, Cora sealed the last stone into place. She retreated to the back of her newly built cell and built a small, modest fire. She waited for the cold to seep through the stones. She waited for the shivering to begin. But it didn't. The heavy limestone walls, insulated and sealed by the thick ash mortar, absorbed the heat from her small fire. The gray mud hardened, trapping the warmth inside the tiny stone cocoon. Within 2 hours, the air inside the sealed alcove was warm enough that Cora had to shrug off her heavy woolen blanket. She sat back against the warm stone, the firelight dancing across the solid gray walls of her handmade fortress. Outside, the wolves howled, and the wind shrieked through the canyon, carrying snow that could bury a man standing up. But inside, it was quiet. It was warm. Cora Whitaker looked at her blistered, mud-caked hands. She had survived the first freeze, but winter had only just begun, and a warm room wouldn't keep her from starving. She closed her eyes, letting the heat of the stone soak into her bones, knowing that tomorrow the real hunt would begin. The warmth of the stone tomb kept her blood flowing, but it could not quiet the hollow ache in her stomach. By the end of her first week in the black timber, Cora Whitaker had boiled and chewed her leather bootlaces, stripping them of whatever tallow and fat remained. She drank hot water steeped with pine needles to ward off the scurvy William had always warned of. But vitamin C was no substitute for calories. She was wasting away. Survival demanded motion, even when her muscles wept for rest. Armed with her rusted hatchet, Cora ventured out into the blinding white silence of the canyon. The snow was thigh-deep, making every step a monumental effort. She needed meat, but without a rifle. Bringing down a deer was an impossible dream. She had to think smaller. She had to think dirtier. Using the frayed threads of her woolen shawl and the tough, fibrous inner bark of the slippery elm trees, she painstakingly braided crude, thin cordage. It took her 3 days, her fingers raw and bleeding, to fashion a half-dozen spring pole snares. She set them along the narrow game trails she found beneath the heavy boughs of the spruce trees, baiting them with the few dried wild rose hips she could scavenge. For 2 days she caught nothing. On the third morning, she found a snowshoe hare hanging suspended by its hind legs, its fur white as the snow around it. Cora dropped to her knees in the drift, weeping tears that froze on her cheeks. She took the hare back to her stone alcove, butchering it with the sharpened edge of her tin cup because the hatchet was too clumsy. She ate the heart and liver raw, unable to wait for the fire, the rich, metallic taste of iron bringing a sudden, dizzying rush of energy back to her brain. She roasted the rest over her small fire, saving every scrap of fur, bone, and sinew. The bones were boiled for broth. The sinew was dried to make stronger cordage. For a month, this was her rhythm. She trapped hares, ptarmigans, and occasionally a careless pine marten. She used the animal fat to treat her cracked skin and coat the rusting iron of her hatchet. She was surviving, but the deep freeze of January was approaching, a time when the small game would burrow deep and disappear. Then, the hunter became the hunted. It started with a feeling of prickling heat at the base of her neck when she checked her snares. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet. No birds chirped. No wind rattled the branches. The next morning she found one of her snares torn apart. The hare she had caught was gone, leaving only a smear of blood and a massive hand-sized paw print compressed into the snow. A mountain lion. And a large one. For 3 days, the beast stalked her. She saw its silhouette on the limestone ridges, a massive silver-gray shadow, moving seamlessly against the winter sky. It was starving, desperate enough to track a human. Cora knew she could not outrun it, and she certainly couldn't fight it hand to hand with a rusted hatchet. If she stayed hidden in her shelter, she would eventually starve. If she went out, she would be torn apart. She had to kill it. Cora spent an entire day reinforcing the entrance to her alcove. She left only a narrow, low tunnel leading to her mortar door, forcing anything that wanted to enter to crawl on its belly. Above this narrow bottleneck, she constructed a deadfall trap. She spent hours hauling a massive, flat slab of limestone weighing nearly 200 pounds up the scree slope. She balanced it precariously on a trigger system carved from thick oak branches, using the strong sinew from the hares to tie the mechanism together. That night, she didn't light a fire. She sat in the freezing darkness of her alcove, holding the hatchet tight against her chest. To bait the trap, she used the only thing the lion wanted: herself. She cut a deep gash into the palm of her left hand, letting the fresh blood drip onto the snow right at the entrance of her crawl space. The metallic scent of human blood bloomed in the frigid air. Then she waited. Hours bled into one another. The cold seeped back into the unheated stone, numbing her legs. Just after midnight, she heard the soft, heavy crunch of snow outside. A low, guttural chuff echoed in the narrow canyon, vibrating in Cora's chest. The moonlight caught a pair of pale yellow eyes peering into the dark tunnel of her shelter. The silver lion hissed, smelling the blood. It was massive, its ribs showing through its thick winter coat, driven mad by hunger. It lowered its heavy head and crept into the bottleneck, its shoulders scraping the stone. It stepped on the trigger stick. The loud crack of the oak snapping was deafening. The 200-pound limestone slab dropped like a guillotine. A bone-shattering crunch echoed through the canyon, followed by a terrifying high-pitched scream that tore the night in half. The slab had come down squarely on the lion's hindquarters and spine, pinning it to the frozen earth. The beast thrashed wildly, its front claws tearing massive gouges into the frozen mud and snow, its jaws snapping at the air. Cora did not hesitate. She crawled out of her alcove, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The beast lunged at her, its teeth missing her face by inches, but the heavy stone held it fast. With a scream of pure, feral survival, Cora swung the frosted hatchet with both hands, bearing the blunt edge deep into the lion's skull. The beast went limp. Cora collapsed into the snow, chest heaving, covered in sweat and blood. She had her winter meat. The silver lion changed everything. The meat frozen in a makeshift cache outside her shelter sustained her through the brutal depths of January and February. The thick, heavy pelt became her armor. She scraped it clean with sharpened limestone, cured it with wood, ash, and the animal's own brains, and wrapped herself in the magnificent silver fur. She was no longer just the exiled widow, she was something forged by the ice. April came to the Dakota Territory not with a whisper, but with a roar. The ice on the canyon rivers shattered, sending torrents of black water rushing toward the valleys. The snow receded, revealing the bruised and muddy earth. In Oak Haven, Rowan Abernathy sat by his roaring hearth, entirely convinced that Cora Whitaker's bones were buried deep beneath the winter drifts. With the spring thaw, the high timber was accessible again. Rowan wasted no time. He drafted a crew of hired toughs led by his ruthless foreman, Jeb Rollins, and the reluctant deputy Cole Higgins. Their orders were simple: survey the 300 acres of Whitaker timber and prepare the logging camps. If you find her remains, Rowan had instructed, puffing on a thick cigar, leave them for the crows. She forfeited her Christian burial the day she dealt with the devil. It took the surveying crew 2 days to hack their way up the overgrown trails into the deep canyon. Jeb Rollins, a mountain of a man with a scarred cheek and a cruel disposition, rode at the front, a Winchester rifle resting across his saddle. Cole rode behind, his eyes scanning the tree line, a heavy knot of guilt sitting in his stomach. On the afternoon of the second day, they smelled the smoke. Campfire, Jeb grunted, pulling his horse up short. Thought this ridge was empty. They dismounted, tying their horses to a dead pine, and crept up the steep limestone scree. As they crested the ridge, they stopped dead in their tracks. Tucked into the cliff face was a fortress. The solid limestone rocks were bound together by a smooth, iron-hard gray mortar. A steady plume of smoke drifted from a cleverly angled chimney hole. Outside the shelter, racks made of stripped branches held strips of dried, black meat. "Scrotters," Jeb spat, cocking the lever of his Winchester. "Rowan ain't gonna like this. Flush 'em out." "Wait, Jeb," Cole protested, recognizing the geography. This was exactly where he had left her. That ain't a squatter's camp. Before Jeb could take another step, the heavy, mortared wooden door of the shelter creaked open. Jeb raised his rifle, yelling, "Come out with your hands up or I'll put a hole through you." A figure stepped out of the dark interior and onto the muddy ledge. Cole Higgins gasped, dropping his revolver into the dirt. It was Cora, but she was unrecognizable as the frail, shivering widow they had cast out 6 months ago. She was draped in the massive silver pelt of the mountain lion, the beast's head resting like a cowl over her dark, unkempt hair. Her face was gaunt, deeply tanned and weathered by wind and smoke, but her eyes were terrifying. They were the eyes of an apex predator, cold and utterly devoid of fear. In her right hand, she held the rusted hatchet. In her left, she held a heavy leather pouch. "That's far enough, Jeb Rollins," Cora's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, echoing off the canyon walls. It didn't crack. It held the authority of the mountain itself. Jeb lowered his rifle a fraction, visibly unnerved by the wild apparition before him. "Mrs. Whitaker? Rowan said you were dead. Said the winter took you." "Rowan is a liar and a thief," Cora stated flatly. "You are trespassing on my land. Turn around and ride back to Oak Haven." Jeb barked a harsh laugh, regaining his bravado. "Your land? You are exiled witch. Rowan holds the deed, and I ain't taking orders from a ghost." He raised the Winchester, aiming it directly at her chest. "Looks like the coal didn't finish the job." "I will." "No," Cole shouted, stepping forward, but he was too far away to stalk the older man. As Jeb's finger tightened on the trigger, Cora moved with lightning speed. She didn't throw the hatchet. Instead, she hurled the heavy leather pouch in her left hand directly at the rocks at Jeb's feet. The pouch exploded upon impact. It was filled with the pure, caustic, quicklime powder she had baked and saved during her first days in the shelter. A massive cloud of stinging, burning white dust erupted into the air, blowing straight into Jeb's face. Jeb screamed, dropping his rifle as the caustic powder coated his eyes and inhaled into his lungs, burning him from the inside out. He stumbled backward, thrashing wildly, clutching at his face in blinding agony. He slipped on the wet mud of the scree slope and went tumbling violently down the sharp rocks, his screams fading as he crashed into the ravine below. The dust settled, the silence returned heavy and absolute. Cole stood frozen, his hands trembling, staring at the spot where Jeb had just been. He slowly looked up at the ledge. Cora was still standing there, unmoving, the silver fur rippling in the spring wind. She picked up Jeb's Winchester from the mud. "Cole," she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a heavy weight. "Cora," he stammered, raising his hand slowly to show he was unarmed. "I didn't want to come here. I swear it." "I know," she replied. She expertly checked the chamber of the rifle, snapping it shut. "I want you to ride back to Oak Haven. You go to the town hall. You tell Rowan Abernethy that the black timber belongs to the widow Whitaker." "He won't listen, Cora. He's got the law in his pocket." "He doesn't have the law up here," she said, her eyes sweeping over the vast, rugged expanse of the canyon. "Tell him the winter didn't kill me. Tell him the mountain didn't kill me. And tell him that if he or any of his men ever step foot over the boundary line again, they will answer to the stone and the ash." Cole swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. "I'll tell him. I swear to God I'll tell him. Go." Cole turned, scrambling down the slope to his horse. He didn't look back as he dug his spurs in, riding like the devil himself was on his heels. Cora stood on the ridge, watching him disappear into the valley. She breathed in the sharp, crisp scent of the melting snow and the damp earth. The cold had tried to break her, but it had only forged her into something harder. She turned and walked back into her stone fortress, the heavy door closing behind her, leaving the canyon to the silence of the spring. Cora Whitaker never returned to the town of Oak Haven. She didn't need their bitter charity or their hollow laws. Instead, she claimed the black timber as her own, a sovereign of stone and ash. The canyon folks still whisper of the widow who froze death itself, a solitary shadow wrapped in silver fur, standing eternal watch over the limestone ridges where she built her life from the ruins.